They told him a black man had no business in those halls of power, that a runaway slave, the son of an enslaved woman, should know his place. They warned that, by daring to speak up, by walking into the nation's spotlight, he was stepping into a trap set to humiliate him and everyone who looked like him. The most powerful men in America had spent generations weaving a narrative of white supremacy to justify slavery, and now they'd have their proof. Their courts, their Congress, their White House, institutions built by slaves and guarded by prejudice, all poised to put him back in his place in front of the entire country. The whispers started as soon as word spread that he might dare address those in high office. He's eloquent for a Negro, sure, they said, but wait until he's facing a room full of white dignitaries. He'll freeze. He'll offend them. He'll make a fool of himself and of his people. Even some abolitionist allies fretted that if this upstart black speaker failed, it would hand a propaganda victory to the slave masters. But what none of them understood, what the cynics and racists couldn't possibly grasp, was that this man had already survived horrors they could never imagine. He had endured the whip, the hunger, the nightmares of slavery that would have broken any of them before they even began, and he was about to deliver the most devastating response to white supremacy the nation had ever witnessed. Not with violence, not with rebellion, but with words, with truth so powerful and so undeniable that history itself would have to take notice. By the time he was done, Frederick Douglass would shake the very foundations of the White House, shatter the slave master's myth of racial inferiority, and leave a president of the United States utterly transformed. This is the story of how a boy born in chains became the man who made a president listen. But to understand how it happened, how a young man with nothing rose to challenge the highest powers in the land, we have to go back to where it all started. February 1818. Talbot County, Maryland, a one-room slave cabin on the eastern shore. He was born into slavery and separated from his mother when he was only an infant. His mother, Harriet Bailey, lived on a distant farm and could only visit her son at night, walking 12 miles in secret just to hold him as he slept. She died when he was about 7, and he was not allowed to be present at her passing. The boy, named Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, entered a world designed to keep him down. He was legally property, with no rights whatsoever. A brutal overseer ruled the plantation, and little Frederick's earliest memories were of violence. He would never forget the morning he awoke to the sound of his Aunt Hester screaming. As the overseer tied her to a beam and whipped her mercilessly, the blood running down her back. That was how he learned the true nature of slavery cruelty without limit. Frederick grew up hungry and cold on that plantation. In the hottest Maryland summers and the bitterest winters, he had no shoes, no coat, nothing but a coarse linen shirt to cover his body to his knees. He often went hungry. The slave children were fed cornmeal mush in a communal trough, and they had to fight each other with bare hands and oyster shells for every bite. At night, little Frederick shivered on the dirt floor with no bed or blanket. He would crawl into a stolen corn sack to stave off the freezing cold, his bare feet cracked and bleeding from frostbite by morning. This was the world of slavery in young Frederick's America, a world where a black child's future was decided at birth field hand. If you're lucky, more likely. Nothing but a piece of property until you die. Anyone who dared suggest otherwise was deemed delusional or dangerous. It was a world that ensured black people remained at the bottom of society. At the bottom. Always at the bottom. And Frederick Douglass lived it in his bones. Yet even in this hellish reality, a spark flickered within the boy. It would be tested by unimaginable trials, but it would not die. Frederick's first break in the clouds came at age 7. In 1825, his enslavers inexplicably sent him away from the bleak plantation to live in Baltimore with a relative of his master. For a boy who had known nothing but the dirt and despair of rural slavery, the bustling port city of Baltimore felt like another world. And there, in the household of Hugh and Sophia Auld, Frederick encountered something truly miraculous kindness. Sophia Auld had never owned a slave before, and at first she treated Frederick almost like an ordinary child, not chattel. In her innocence, she even taught him the alphabet. In a sunlit upstairs room, Sophia started showing the boy his letters, sounding out small words. It was an act of simple kindness and absolute heresy in a slave state. When her husband Hugh discovered what was happening, he exploded in anger. One day, he stormed in to find the young black boy poring over a primer. Snatching the book away, Hugh Auld laid down the law to his wife. If you teach that end-users hear how to read, there will be no keeping him.
It will forever unfit him to be a slave,
he raged. Frederick stood trembling in the corner, but his ears drank in every word. Auld insisted that education would spoil the best slave. He'll become unmanageable, of no value to his master.
It'll make him discontented and unhappy.
In that moment, Frederick glimpsed the entire design of oppression laid bare. These words sank deep into my heart, he later wrote, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. He understood now why enslavers wanted their captives kept illiterate. Knowledge would give a slave awareness, and awareness would give him the desire and power to resist. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. Douglass recalled, his master had unintentionally shown him the key to the lock. Sophia Auld, chastened, stopped the lessons and soon turned cold. Slavery quickly corrupted her kind heart. But it was too late. The spark had been lit in Frederick's mind. Denied any formal teacher, he became ingenious. He turned the streets of Baltimore into his classroom. Whenever he ran errands, he carried extra bread in his pocket. If he passed a hungry poor white boy on the street, Frederick would offer bread in exchange for a quick reading lesson. Many of those street urchins obliged, unwittingly trading the bread of knowledge for a few crusts of actual bread. Frederick also secretly studied the letters on shipyard timbers and in discarded newspapers. By any means necessary, he learned to read and write. Once that door to literacy cracked open, Frederick pushed it wide with voracious hunger. Around age 12, he got hold of a popular anthology called The Columbian Orator, a collection of political speeches. In its pages he discovered essays on liberty, dialogues on human rights, fiery denunciations of tyranny. One piece especially captivated him, a dialogue between a slave and a master, in which the slave argued so eloquently for his freedom that the odd master voluntarily emancipated him. Frederick read that over and over, astonished. Language itself was a weapon, he realized. Words could unlock chains, arguments could achieve what bullets sometimes could not. With every paragraph he read, new ideas and unutterable loathing of slavery filled his mind. But with enlightenment came agony. The more Frederick learned, the more painfully he understood the injustice of his bondage. It opened my eyes to the horrible pit, but to no ladder upon which to get out. He said of gaining literacy. Before, he had dim hopes of freedom, but little sense of the broader world. Now, through books and newspapers, he fully grasped the scale of the tyranny he was under and the liberty he was missing. It made his condition almost unbearable. At times, he confessed he wished he could undo the knowledge, because it tortured him with visions of a life he couldn't yet have. I envied my fellow slaves for their stupidity. He admitted, understanding the cruel irony that awareness brought pain. Yet, despite that despair, Frederick did not relent. He later said hearing Master Auld forbid his education was the best thing that ever happened for him for it. Inspired me with a desire and determination to learn at any cost. What Auld most dreaded, Frederick most desired. The very argument Auld had so angrily made against Frederick's learning, the boy took as ironclad proof for it. In secret, Frederick even risked his life by teaching other enslaved people to read. While still in his teens, on Sunday evenings he would gather a group of slaves in a remote cabin and conduct a covert Sunday school, sharing the forbidden knowledge of letters and scripture. Dozens came, risking brutal punishment for a chance at the bread of knowledge. When plantation owners discovered these stealthy lessons, they burst in with clubs and dispersed the school with violence, but by then many of Frederick's pupils had learned enough to continue on their own. At about 16, Frederick's increasing intellect and assertiveness alarmed his owner, Thomas Auld. In 1834, Auld decided to break the defiant teenager. He hired Frederick out to a nearby farmer named Edward Covey, infamous as a slave breaker. For months, Covey beat Frederick nearly every day, trying to crush the spark of dignity the boy carried. Covey worked him from before dawn till after dark, in all weather, and whipped him savagely for any reason or no reason at all. Frederick later admitted that under Covey's relentless abuse he was broken in body, soul, and spirit, reduced to despair and thoughts of suicide. Until one hot August afternoon in 1834, Frederick's spirit exploded. When Covey attempted yet another vicious whipping, Frederick fought back. He grabbed the overseer's whip out of his hand. What followed was an epic 2-hour hand-to-hand battle in the barn. Covey, an adult white man used to dominating others, was stunned to find the black youth fighting like a cornered lion. They wrestled and writhed across the dirt floor. In the end, Covey, bruised, sweat-soaked, gasping for air, backed off. He never again laid a hand on Frederick Douglass. Out of pride and fear of losing his reputation, Covey told no one of the defeat, and Frederick had discovered something profound: he could physically resist and win. This battle with Mr. Covey was the turning point in my career as a slave, he wrote. It rekindled the few expiring embers of freedom and revived within me a sense of my own manhood. It recalled the departed self-confidence and inspired me again with a determination to be free. From that day forward, no whip ever struck Frederick Douglass's back again. His body remained legally enslaved for a time, but his spirit, unbreakable. Frederick Douglass's body stayed in chains for a few more years after Covey, but in his mind he was already free. In 1836, at about 18, he made his first daring attempt to escape bondage. He and a few trusted slave friends planned to canoe up the Chesapeake Bay and follow the North Star to Pennsylvania. Frederick even forged travel passes for each man, imitating a master's handwriting he had seen. But on the eve of their intended flight, someone betrayed the plan. Frederick and his comrades were seized and thrown into jail. He spent weeks in a dark cell, expecting at any moment to be sold off to the Deep South as punishment, a fate equivalent to death in the cotton fields of Mississippi. But incredibly, Thomas Auld did not sell Frederick. Instead, perhaps uneasy about the rebellious young man, Auld sent him back to Baltimore to work again for Hugh and Sophia Auld. Frederick got one more chance at a life in the city rather than on the plantation. He did not intend to squander it. 2 years later, in 1838, Frederick Douglass risked everything for freedom once more. This time he told no one, not even his closest friends. Early on the morning of September 3, 1838, the 20-year-old stepped onto a northbound train in Baltimore disguised as a free black sailor. He wore a red flannel shirt, a tarpaulin sailor's hat, and a black neckerchief loosely tied, the typical outfit of black seamen at the docks. In his pocket, he carried papers borrowed from a free African-American sailor, documents that might pass cursory inspection if he was lucky. It was a tense gambit. As the train chugged north, every time the conductor approached, Frederick's heart pounded. At any moment, someone might see through his disguise. When the conductor did come for tickets and papers, Frederick fumbled. The sailor's protection papers described a man with a darker complexion than his. The conductor peered at him. Frederick was sure he was caught. But after a shrug, the official handed back the papers and moved on. Frederick suppressed a sigh of relief and prayed. He had to make several connections, a ferry across the Susquehanna River, then another train through Delaware. Each mile north was a mile deeper into freedom, yet danger was everywhere. Slave catchers prowled the routes, hunting runaways. Fellow passengers could be informants. Frederick spent the journey in a state of taut vigilance, anxious and most perilous, he later said. Finally, after about 24 hours of nerve-wracking travel, the train reached New York City. On September 4, 1838, Frederick Douglass set foot in Manhattan and, in his own words, found myself in the big city of New York, a free man. The relief and joy of that moment would remain unmatched in his life. My free life began on the 3rd of September 1838, he wrote, and I have never been happier. Freedom, however, was terrifying in its own way. Imagine, he had escaped with literally nothing but the clothes on his back and a borrowed sailor's ticket. He knew no one in New York. Slave catchers roamed even free. Northern cities, and the law would permit them to haul him back to slavery if they found him. Frederick spent his first day of freedom in near panic. Every white face looked suspicious. Any moment he expected a heavy hand on his shoulder and a voice snarling, "Gotcha!" He later wrote that he felt like a hunted stranger in the crowded city streets. Thankfully, the abolitionist underground embraced him. Frederick found shelter through a network of anti-slavery activists. Most importantly, within 24 hours of his arrival, he was reunited with the young woman who had helped make his escape possible, Anna Murray. Anna was a free black woman from Baltimore who had fallen in love with Frederick when he was an enslaved teenager. She had encouraged his dreams of freedom and even provided some money and a sailor's uniform for his disguise. As soon as Frederick sent word that he had made it to New York, Anna traveled by steamboat to join him. On September 15, 1838, in a safe house in Manhattan, they were married. Douglass later said that without Anna, he might never have escaped. She believed in his dream of freedom even more than he did. With slave catchers sniffing around New York, the newlyweds decided to continue on to Massachusetts, a stronghold of anti-slavery sentiment. They settled in New Bedford, MA, far from the reach of Maryland slave catchers. Upon arrival, a free black couple, Mary and Nathan Johnson, gave the young fugitives shelter and introduced them to the local abolitionist community. Nathan Johnson also helped Frederick choose a new surname to live under. There were already too many black folks named Johnson in New Bedford, so Nathan suggested Douglass, after a noble character in a Sir Walter Scott poem. And so Frederick Bailey became Frederick Douglass, a new name for his new life. It was the final step in his self-reinvention. The former slave had forged a new identity as a free man. In New Bedford, Frederick and Anna began the long, uncertain work of building a life in freedom. Frederick was astonished to see many black New Englanders living in tidy homes, earning wages, carrying themselves with the dignity that slavery had tried to strip away. Still, racism was alive, even in the free North. Douglass, highly skilled from his years in Baltimore's shipyards, went to the docks to seek work as a caulker, but white workers refused to work alongside a black man. Barred from the trade he knew, he had to take humbler jobs loading ships, sweeping chimneys, menial labor far below his talents, but necessary to survive. It was a humbling reminder that escaping slavery did not mean escaping racism. He might not wear chains, but prejudice still hemmed him in. Yet New Bedford offered something priceless: community and ideas. Douglass befriended free blacks and white radicals alike. He became active in local black churches and abolitionist circles, and he avidly read William Lloyd Garrison's anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, which sharpened his political insight. In August 1841, at an anti-slavery convention in Nantucket, 23-year-old Frederick Douglass was unexpectedly invited to speak about his life. Trembling with nerves, he recounted the simple facts of his bondage, the whippings, the hunger, the longing for freedom. His mostly white audience sat riveted. When he finished, the hall fell silent, then burst into astonished applause. Abolitionist leaders on stage were wiping tears from their eyes. The Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society immediately hired Douglass as a traveling lecturer. Almost overnight, the unknown fugitive became a sensation, a brilliant black orator packing halls across the North. The one thing the enemies of abolition said a black man couldn't do, speak truth to power, as an equal he was now doing dazzlingly every day. With fame came danger. In 1843, during a lecture tour in Indiana, Douglass was attacked by a mob of angry white men. They chased and beat him, yelling racial slurs and threats to lynch him. His right hand was broken in the fray, an injury that healed badly and caused him pain for the rest of his life. Undeterred, Douglass kept speaking, but he learned to expect violence and death threats wherever he traveled. He later said he never lectured in those years without a loaded pistol or a trusted friend watching his back. As Douglass's reputation grew, some skeptics in the audience whispered that no enslaved person could be that eloquent. He must be an impostor. In response, in 1845, Douglass boldly published his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, laying bare the names of his former enslavers and the details of his bondage. It was a literary sensation, and it put him in grave peril. By naming names, Douglass had effectively outed himself as a fugitive under the law. Maryland slaveholders seethed and swore they would capture him. On the advice of friends, Douglass fled to Britain in late 1845 to avoid recapture. He spent almost 2 years speaking in England. Ireland and Scotland, where, for the first time, he was treated not as a curiosity, but as a respected equal. One British admirer, shocked at the prejudice Douglass still faced from some quarters, remarked, "Is this the man to whom Americans refused a seat on a railway car?" In 1846, English supporters raised money to purchase Douglass's legal freedom from Thomas Auld for the price of 150s, about 750 udies. Douglass was now truly free under the law. He returned to the United States in 1847 with a mission and new confidence. That year, in Rochester, New York, the 29-year-old firebrand launched his own anti-slavery newspaper, the North Star. Many white abolitionists were uneasy about a black man running his own paper. William Lloyd Garrison himself gently suggested Douglass lacked the experience. But Douglass persisted. The North Star's motto declared, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color." By starting his own press, Douglass asserted black independence and leadership in the movement. He also began to chart his own course. Over time, he split from some of his early allies on matters of strategy. For example, Garrison believed the U.S. Constitution was an irredeemably pro-slavery document. He famously burned a copy at a rally, whereas Douglass came to believe the Constitution could be interpreted as an anti-slavery charter if the country had the will. In 1851, Douglass publicly broke with Garrison on this point, a painful rift in their friendship, but one that signaled Douglass's evolution from protege Jew to independent leader. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Douglass pushed President Abraham Lincoln to make it a war for emancipation, not just union. He fiercely criticized Lincoln's early caution. "We are striking the rebels with our soft white hand, when we should be striking them with the iron hand of the black man," he declared. For 2 years, Lincoln resisted calls to arm black men or disturb slavery in the loyal border states. Douglass hammered him in speeches and editorials, warning that the Union's moral weakness was prolonging the war. Finally, on January 1, 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring slaves in rebel territory forever free, and opened the Union Army to black recruits. Douglass rejoiced. He immediately became one of the leading recruiters of black troops. He helped raise the first black regiments, even enlisting 2 of his own sons in the 54th Massachusetts, and urged thousands of black men to enlist and fight for their freedom. Douglass also went to Washington to demand equal pay and fair treatment for black Union soldiers, stands that would soon bring him face to face with the commander-in-chief. In August 1863, Frederick Douglass traveled to Washington, D.C., determined to press his case directly to President Lincoln. Many in his circle warned that he would never get an audience, or worse, that he'd be thrown out or humiliated. But to everyone's surprise, when Douglass arrived at the White House, he was admitted almost immediately. Lincoln's staff had orders to welcome him if he came. As Douglass waited briefly in the vestibule, he felt a jolt of emotion. Not long ago he had been hiding from slave catchers. Now he was being welcomed into the president's house. A door opened, and an usher led him into Abraham Lincoln's office. The tall, gaunt president rose from his chair and extended his hand. "Mr. Douglass, I know who you are. I'm glad to see you," Lincoln said warmly. He offered Douglass a seat. For a moment, Frederick was disarmed by the genuine respect in Lincoln's voice. No American president had ever addressed a black man as a social equal like this. Douglass gathered himself and stated his business. He explained bluntly that he had stopped recruiting black troops because of the unfair treatment they received. He laid out the facts. The pay black soldiers received was lower than whites, black men could not become officers, and the Confederates were murdering or enslaving captured black Union soldiers instead of treating them as POWs. Douglass implored Lincoln to do something to make the Union's commitment to its black soldiers as real as the black soldiers' commitment to the Union. Lincoln listened carefully, his eyebrows knitted in concern. He had heard reports of these issues, but here was Douglass giving first-hand accounts and moral weight to each point. The 2 men talked for perhaps an hour. It was a candid conversation. Douglass did not mince words about his disappointment in certain policies. Lincoln did not promise miracles or immediate changes, but he assured Douglass that he would act on the unequal pay issue. Indeed, by mid-1864, Congress equalized pay for black soldiers and made it retroactive, due in part to such advocacy. Douglass pressed Lincoln to retaliate for Confederate atrocities against black abus. Lincoln was troubled, but said he was reluctant to execute Confederate prisoners in reprisal, fearing it would trigger a cycle of barbarity. They disagreed on that, but respectfully. When Douglass left the White House that day, he felt heard and seen in a way he had never experienced from a powerful white leader. He was serious and even troubled by what I had said. Douglass remembered of Lincoln's demeanor. The president, Douglass realized, was a man bearing the immense weight of war, and who had perhaps not fully understood the depth of injustice black soldiers faced until this meeting. Douglass later remarked, "While I could not agree with him on everything, I could but respect his humane spirit." That respect was mutual. Lincoln reportedly told his staff that there was no man in the country whose opinion he valued more than Douglass's. It is hard to overstate how unprecedented this was. The President of the United States treating a black abolitionist not as a supplicant, not as a token, but as a trusted advisor on policy and morality. They met again a year later, in August 1864, with Lincoln facing a tough re-election and fearing he might lose to an opponent who would make peace with the South. The president invited Douglass back to the White House. Lincoln confided that if he lost in November, he wanted Douglass to help him with a last-ditch mission, a plan to secretly send agents into the South to ferry as many slaves as possible to freedom, before a potential peace deal could leave them in chains. Essentially, Lincoln asked Douglass to prepare to lead a guerrilla underground railroad behind Confederate lines. Douglass agreed to draw up the plans. In the end, Lincoln won re-election decisively, and this audacious mission was not needed but for those hours in conversation. The rail splitter president and the former slave truly were, as a biographer noted, making a revolution together. The climax of their relationship came on March 4, 1865, Lincoln's second inauguration. Douglass attended the inauguration and heard the president's address, the famous, "With malice toward none, with charity for all," speech with the crowd. That evening, he went to the White House for the inaugural reception. Initially, guards tried to bar him at the door. They told Douglass that colored people were not allowed at the president's party. Douglass insisted he had an invitation. When they refused to let him pass, he sent word through a sympathetic gentleman inside. Minutes later, a commotion stirred. In the midst of the reception, President Lincoln himself was striding toward the entrance, spotting Douglass in the crush of people.
"Here comes my friend, Douglass!"
Lincoln announced loudly, so that all in the East Room could hear. He shook Douglass's hand warmly and led him into the room. "I am glad to see you. I saw you in the crowd today. Listening to my address, how did you like it?" Lincoln asked. Douglass, caught off guard by the attention, hundreds of society's elite were watching this exchange in astonishment, tried to demur. "Mr. Lincoln, it was a sacred effort." He did not wish to hold up the line, but Lincoln would not let him slip away. No, you must tell me what you really think. There is no man in this country whose opinion I value more than yours," the president said. Those close enough to hear gasped. The white dignitaries who overheard stood dumbfounded. The President of the United States openly stating that a black man's opinion was among the most valued in the nation. Douglass finally replied that he found the inaugural address sacred and full of wisdom. "Thank you," Lincoln said gratefully. The two men smiled, two friends, as Lincoln now openly considered them. It was a moment that defied every racist expectation of their age. If the enslavers of Douglass's youth had witnessed it, they would scarcely have believed their eyes. A few weeks later, on April 14, 1865, Lincoln was assassinated. Douglass grieved deeply for the fallen president. He had not always agreed with Lincoln, but he came to believe Lincoln was a truly great man, emphatically the black man's president. Douglass would eulogize him years later. The Civil War ended in Union victory, and in December 1865 the 13th Amendment was ratified, outlawing slavery throughout the United States. Frederick Douglass had lived to see the triumphant culmination of the cause to which he had devoted his life. He might have been content to rest then, to finally lay down the burden. But Frederick Douglass was not one for resting, and America's racial struggles were far from over. Frederick Douglass paid a steep price for always speaking truth to power. The threats, the hatred, the physical and mental toll, it all accumulated over the decades. He endured constant death threats from his mid-20s onward. Pro-slavery enemies had wanted him dead before the Civil War. After emancipation, new enemies, white supremacists and resentful ex-Confederates, targeted him for the same reason. His voice was too powerful, too effective at exposing racism. Douglass's mail often contained vicious hate letters. During Reconstruction, the Ku Klux Klan rose, and as the most prominent black leader in America, Douglass was very much in their crosshairs. He had to be careful when traveling. More than once he narrowly avoided ambush or violence on the road. In 1872, one of the most painful blows landed not on Douglass's body but on his home. Late one night, a fire broke out at his house in Rochester, New York. He and his family barely escaped with their lives. The entire home burned to the ground, and with it went precious manuscripts, letters, and keepsakes of his journey from slavery to statesman. Douglass was convinced the fire was no accident, likely an arson attack by enemies angered at his outspokenness. The loss was devastating. Priceless handwritten chapters of his next autobiography and other personal papers were reduced to ash. He took it as a message: we can still get to you. We can take everything from you. Douglass mourned the loss, then responded in the only way he knew, by pressing on. He moved his family to Washington, D.C., cellars for safety in numbers and closer access to the halls of power, and continued the fight. His family life, indeed, bore the brunt of his sacrifices. While Douglass was touring Britain or crisscrossing America to give speeches, his wife Anna was home alone in Rochester raising their 5 children. She had little formal education and never felt comfortable in his intellectual circles, yet she was the rock that kept the family together. Douglass loved Anna deeply, but he was often an absent husband and father for the sake of the cause. This undoubtedly caused strain and sorrow, something he rarely spoke about publicly. In 1860, their youngest daughter Annie died of illness at the age of 10 while Douglass was away in England on a lecture tour. The news shattered him. He rushed home. Guilt-ridden that he had not been there. The image of little Annie on her deathbed haunted Douglass, one more private sacrifice on the altar of freedom. Even after slavery was abolished, Douglass could not rest. He once hoped that Union victory, emancipation, and constitutional amendments would finish the work. But as Reconstruction waned in the 1870s, he saw new battles rising. Southern states enacted black codes, then Jim Crow segregation laws to oppress black citizens anew. Racial violence and lynching surged. Slavery is not abolished until the black man has the ballot, Douglass had declared during the war prophetically. After the war, he kept fighting for black men to have voting rights, achieved with the 15th Amendment in 1870, and then he fought to protect those rights from being eroded by terror and fraud. He battled for integrated schools, served on committees, and gave fiery speeches blasting the nation for backsliding on its promises. He was outraged by the Supreme Court's 1883 decision nullifying civil rights protections, calling it a grievous step backward that invited a new era of oppression. This constant struggle wore on him. He aged prematurely, his hair turned white, his gait slowed, though his voice remained as thunderous as ever. The federal government, which he now worked within, sometimes surveilled black activists deemed too agitating. It's quite possible that Douglass's letters and meetings were monitored by those in power. President Andrew Johnson, Lincoln's successor, openly disliked and distrusted Douglass. In 1866, when Douglass led a delegation of black leaders to meet Johnson and urge black voting rights, Johnson rudely dismissed them and insinuated they wanted a race war. After that meeting, Douglass knew the White House had turned hostile again. Johnson's administration did its best to marginalize Douglass and ignore his appeals. There were personal sacrifices that cannot be quantified, the peace of mind he never had, the traumas that revisited him in nightmares. By his own account, Douglass sometimes awoke screaming in the night, reliving Aunt Hester's screams, or the bite of Covey's whip. Today we might call it post-traumatic stress. He seldom had time for rest or hobbies. His mission was all-consuming, and it took a toll on his health. In the late 1880s, Douglass began to slow down under these cumulative strains, yet he refused to quit. On February 20, 1895, at age 77, Frederick Douglass attended a meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington, D.C., where he was a featured speaker and notably, the only man on the stage. He spoke passionately about women's right to vote and received a standing ovation. That evening, after returning home and excitedly recounting the event to his second wife, Douglass suddenly collapsed from a massive heart attack. It was as if a mighty voice had finally, gently been stilled. He died literally with his boots on, active in the cause, until his final hours. Victory, as Douglass experienced it, never equaled safety. He won great battles: emancipation, equal citizenship for Black Americans enshrined in the Constitution, and his own ascent to respect and influence. But each triumph was met with new challenges, new opposition. He had helped free 4 million people, but he could not free them from prejudice and poverty overnight, and seeing the painfully slow progress sometimes broke his heart. Douglass used to say he felt like one who had escaped a den of wild beasts, only to be pursued by the shadow of those beasts wherever I go. He remained vigilant until the end, knowing that freedom can always be taken away if good people let down their guard. It is tempting to remember Frederick Douglass as a flawless hero, but the real man was more complicated. He was not without flaws or contradictions. He even acknowledged that the great emancipator, Abraham Lincoln, had limits. In 1876, he told a crowd that Lincoln, in his interests, in his associations, in his habits of thought, and in his prejudices, he was a white man. You are the children of Abraham Lincoln. We are at best only his stepchildren. Those words spoken at the unveiling of a D.C. memorial to Lincoln shocked some listeners, but Douglass was making a point. Heroes can have great faults, and the same was true of Douglass himself. He could be proud and stubborn. He clashed with allies at times and caused controversy, such as when he married a white woman, Helen Pitts, in 1884. Even his own children were displeased by the interracial marriage. One criticized for marrying a white woman. He wryly remarked that his first wife was the color of his mother and his second the color of his father, but even that humor didn't silence his detractors. In 1869, Douglass infuriated old friends like Elizabeth Cady Stanton when he supported the 15th Amendment granting black men the vote while women still could not vote. He argued it was the Negro's hour, insisting black men's needs were most urgent, which led to a bitter rift with some feminists. He also accepted high public offices later in life, becoming U.S. Marshal of Washington, D.C., and later Minister to Haiti, moves that made some younger black radicals whisper that Douglass had become part of the establishment. In truth, he was a man brilliant and principled, but also human and full of contradictions. These nuances do not diminish Douglass's legacy, they deepen it. They show that he was not a marble statue on a pedestal, but a living, striving person who evolved with the times. Frederick Douglass lived to see slavery abolished, but he knew the struggle for equality was far from over. He spent his remaining years urging America to live up to its founding ideals and challenging future generations to continue the fight. He knew even great leaders like Lincoln had contradictions. As he said, heroes can be flawed. His story shows that progress is possible, but never guaranteed, that freedom won can always be lost if we grow complacent. Painful, triumphant, unfinished Douglass's life was the real American story, with all its ugly scars and moments of redemption. He made change possible, not alone, never alone, but as part of a larger movement. He ran his race and left us an example we're still striving to follow. One life, countless battles, a legacy that changed the world. Generations after his death, Douglass's example inspired other freedom fighters, from the activists of the early civil rights movement to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who often invoked Douglass's name. Even today, his words are quoted by those still fighting for justice. Douglass showed us what is possible and what it costs, what it means to speak truth to power and defy the odds. His fight is over, but ours continues on the path he cleared. Frederick Douglass did that, and the world will never be the same.